A stranger at the gym had a tattoo of my father's face. My father died in a car accident a year ago, and it took me months before I felt ready to get a memorial tattoo. I finally found a portrait artist who specialized in realistic tattoos and gave him my favorite photo of my dad. The tattoo came out incredible on my forearm, and my dad was right there looking back at me. I've been showing it off to friends and family for about 6 months when I went to a new gym closer to my office. I was on the treadmill one morning when the guy next to me reached up to adjust his headphones, and I saw a portrait tattoo on his forearm. I glanced over casually and my legs almost gave out. It was my father's face. Not similar, not kind of like him. It was him. Same eyes, same crooked smile, same everything. I stared so hard the guy noticed and gave me a weird look. I had to say something. "That's an amazing tattoo," I managed to get out. "Who is it?" He smiled and said it was his dad who passed away a couple years back. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Without saying anything, I pulled up my sleeve and held my forearm next to his. He looked down at my tattoo and then back at his own. The color drained from his face. "What the hell?" he said. "That's my dad." We both got off the treadmills and went to the locker room where we could talk without people staring. He kept looking at my tattoo like he was seeing a ghost. "What's your name?" I asked. "Colin." He was shaking. My dad's name was Noah Hutchinson. He died last March in a car accident. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. My dad was Noah Hutchinson. He died in March, too, in a car accident. Colin sat down hard on the bench and put his head in his hands. We sat there in silence for a full minute before he asked if there was a funeral. I told him no. My dad had always said he wanted to be cremated immediately with no service. Colin looked up at me. That's what my mom said, too. That's why we never ran into each other. I asked him where he grew up, and he said Seattle. I said Portland. He asked if my dad traveled a lot for work, and I said yes. 2 weeks gone and 2 weeks home my entire childhood. Colin started laughing, but it wasn't a happy sound. 2 weeks. Always exactly 2 weeks. We exchanged numbers and agreed to meet in a few days because neither of us could handle this conversation in a gym locker room. I drove home in complete shock and had to pull over twice because my hands were shaking too hard to steer. When I got to my apartment, I sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at the tattoo on my arm. Every memory I had of my dad felt like a lie now. Every time he said he had to go on a business trip. Every time he missed my birthday or a school event because of work. He wasn't working. He was with another family, with another son. I finally went inside and immediately called my mom. "Did you know Dad had another family?" The words came out harsher than I meant them to. There was a long silence on the other end. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shaking. I told her everything about Colin and the tattoo and the matching details. She started crying so hard she couldn't speak. When she finally caught her breath, she told me she had no idea and asked how this was even possible. I told her I didn't know, but I was going to find out. After I hung up, I went through every box of my dad's things I'd kept. I found credit card statements my mom must have missed. Charges in Seattle for groceries, gas, restaurants, plane tickets, hotel receipts from years ago before he apparently got the apartment. My phone buzzed with a text from Colin. I told my mom. She's devastated. Neither of them knew. I texted back asking if he wanted to meet the next day instead of waiting. I couldn't sleep anyway. Colin came over the next morning and we spread everything out on my living room floor. Credit card statements, plane tickets, apartment rent receipts going back 3 decades. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. 2 weeks in Portland, 2 weeks in Seattle, back and forth for 30 years. We barely spoke while we went through it all because what was there to say? Colin found a birthday card in one of the folders. It said, "Happy birthday, Daddy," in crayon with a little flower drawn at the bottom. It was signed Michelle. I looked at him. "Do you have a sister?" He shook his head. "Do you?" I said no and felt my stomach turn. Colin opened his laptop and started searching social media for any Michelle connected to our dad's name. I watched him scroll for 20 minutes, my heart pounding harder with each minute. Then he stopped. Oh God. He turned the screen toward me. There was a woman in Phoenix, probably in her early 20s, with photos of our dad on her page from years ago. One photo showed him holding a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. The caption said, "Best dad in the world." Her mom was tagged in the photos. A third woman we'd never seen before. Colin and I just stared at the screen. I thought about all the times my dad told me I was his whole world, that being my father was the best thing that ever happened to him. He'd said those exact words to me the week before he died, and apparently he'd said them to Colin too, and probably to Michelle. I looked at Colin and asked the question we were both thinking. How many families do you think he had? Colin closed the laptop and rubbed his face with both hands. We sat there staring at the coffee table covered in papers and receipts, neither of us wanting to say what we both knew. I picked up my phone and opened Facebook, searching for Michelle's profile again. Her page showed photos from last week, pictures of her at work, normal life stuff. I clicked on the message button and my hand started shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. I typed slowly, deleting and rewriting the first sentence 3 times before settling on something that felt less horrible than the other options. The message explained who I was, that I was Noah Hutchinson's son, and asked if we could talk about something important regarding him. I read it 5 times before hitting send, then immediately wanted to take it back. Colin watched me put the phone down on the table between us, and we both stared at it like it might explode. My chest felt tight and I realized I was holding my breath. This woman in Phoenix had no idea what was about to hit her. She'd spent her whole life thinking her dad was just hers, same as I had until 2 days ago. The phone screen stayed dark. No immediate response. I checked the time and saw it was almost noon on a Saturday. She might be at work or out with friends or doing anything normal people do when their world isn't falling apart. Colin suggested we get food, but neither of us moved. 20 minutes passed, then 40. I picked up the phone to check if the message had actually sent and saw 3 dots appear at the bottom of the screen. Michelle was typing. The dots disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Finally, a message came through asking who I was and why I was contacting her about her father who died over a year ago. The tone was confused, but also defensive, like she thought this might be some kind of scam. I took a screenshot of my tattoo and Colin's tattoo side by side, the two identical portraits of our father staring back at the camera. I attached the photo and sent it with a message saying we needed to talk, and this wasn't a joke. The 3 dots appeared immediately this time, then stopped, then appeared again. No message came through for 5 full minutes. I set the phone down and told Colin she probably thought we were crazy. He said he would have thought the same thing 3 days ago. The phone rang and I jumped so hard I knocked over my coffee mug. Michelle's name appeared on the screen. I answered and heard crying before anyone spoke. Her voice came through broken and raw, asking what kind of sick joke this was and how we got that photo. I told her it wasn't a joke and asked if she could look through her mom's old papers, specifically credit card statements from the past few years. She kept crying and saying her dad would never do something like this. He loved her mom. He loved their family. I waited while she cried and finally she said she'd call back. The line went dead. Colin asked what she said and I told him she needed time to check something. 3 hours crawled by. I tried to watch TV but couldn't focus on anything. Colin ordered pizza that neither of us ate. My phone rang again at almost 4 in the afternoon. Michelle's voice sounded completely different now, flat and hollow. She said she found her mom's credit card statements in a box in the garage. The charges matched everything we'd found. Groceries in Portland on dates when her dad was supposedly on business trips. Plane tickets to Seattle. Hotel stays in cities she'd never heard him mention. She asked if we could video chat right now because she needed to see our faces. I told her yes and opened my laptop. Colin moved his chair next to mine so we'd both be in frame. Michelle's face appeared on screen, and I felt like I was looking at a female version of myself. Same eyes, same nose, same expression of complete shock. She held up her phone showing a photo of our dad at her high school graduation. The 3 of us just stared at each other for a solid minute before anyone spoke. Michelle asked where we grew up, and when Colin said Seattle and I said Portland, she closed her eyes and nodded like she'd been expecting it. We spent the next 2 hours going through our childhoods piece by piece. Michelle said her dad worked in regional sales and traveled every other 2 weeks for his territory. Colin and I explained our dad's business trips followed the exact same pattern. Michelle pulled up old calendars on her phone showing when her dad was home and when he was gone. The dates lined up perfectly with the opposite of our schedules. When her dad was in Phoenix, mine was in Seattle, and Colin's was in Portland. The rotation was so precise it made me feel sick. Michelle started crying again when she realized her dad had missed her 8th grade graduation because he was probably at one of our events instead. Colin asked about her mom, and Michelle explained she was a nurse who worked night shifts at the hospital, usually gone from 7 at night until 7 in the morning. Our dad would have been alone in the house all night, free to make phone calls or do whatever he needed without anyone noticing. The calculation behind it all made my skin crawl. He hadn't just lied, he'd engineered entire lives around shift schedules and travel patterns. Michelle asked if we thought there were more families, and neither Colin nor I had an answer. We agreed we needed to tell our mothers before doing anything else. Each of us would talk to our own mom, give them time to process, and then figure out next steps. Michelle said her mom was working a double shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home until tomorrow morning. Colin said he'd call his mom tonight. I looked at the clock and saw it was almost 6. I told them my mom could probably come over now and we should just get this over with. We ended the video call and I sat staring at my phone for 5 minutes before calling my mom. She answered on the second ring sounding cheerful and asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I told her I needed her to come to my apartment instead, that I'd found more information about Dad. Her voice changed immediately, going quiet and careful. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes. Colin stood up to leave, but I asked him to stay. I needed someone else in the room who understood what this felt like. My mom arrived 18 minutes later, still wearing her work clothes. She looked at Colin sitting on my couch and then at me, her face already showing worry. I asked her to sit down and started pulling out all the evidence we'd compiled. The credit card statements, the photos of Michelle, the matching timelines. She picked up each piece of paper slowly, reading everything twice like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Michelle's graduation photo sat on top of the pile, and my mom stared at it for a long time before asking who the girl was. I told her that was Michelle, my half-sister from Phoenix. My mom set the photo down carefully and didn't say anything for almost 20 minutes. She just sat there looking at the evidence spread across my coffee table. Finally, she asked if I thought my entire childhood was a lie. Her voice cracked on the last word. I moved to sit next to her and tried to figure out how to answer that question. I told her that Dad loved us. That part had to be real because I remembered it. I felt it my whole life. But he also loved other families the same way he loved us. She looked at me with tears running down her face and asked how that was even possible. I realized I didn't have an answer that made any sense. How does someone love 5 different families and lie to all of them for 30 years? My phone buzzed with a text from Colin, who'd stepped outside to give us privacy. The message said he told his mom everything, and she was devastated, but wanted to know if there were more families we hadn't found yet. I showed my mom the text and watched her face crumble. She asked how many more there could be, and I said I didn't know, but we were going to find out. My phone rang 20 minutes after my mom left, and Michelle's name showed on the screen. I answered and heard her crying so hard she couldn't speak for almost a minute. When she finally got words out, she told me her mom asked if Michelle was even really Noah's daughter. The question came after Michelle showed her mom all the evidence we'd found. Her mom started doubting everything, wondering if Noah lied about Michelle's paternity too, if their entire relationship was built on more lies than they'd discovered. Michelle kept saying she didn't know what was real anymore, that every memory felt fake, that she couldn't trust anything her dad ever told her. I tried to tell her that the DNA would prove she was his daughter, that we could get tests done if she needed that certainty, but she just cried harder and said she had to go. The call ended and I sat staring at my phone, thinking about how this betrayal was spreading like poison through all our families, making everyone question everything. I couldn't sleep that night, so I went back through more of my dad's papers around 2 in the morning. I found a folder I'd missed before tucked behind some old tax returns. Inside was a rental agreement for a storage unit across town, dated from 8 years ago with automatic payments coming out of an account I'd never seen before. The address meant nothing to me, and I had no idea what could be in there. I texted Colin at 6 in the morning asking if he could meet me at the storage unit later. He responded within 5 minutes saying he'd be there at 9. I drove to the facility at 8:30 and waited in my car, watching other people come and go with their boxes and furniture, living their normal lives while mine kept falling apart. Colin pulled up right at 9 and we walked to the unit together without saying much. I used the key I'd found with the rental agreement, and the door rolled up to show boxes stacked floor to ceiling, all labeled and organized like some kind of twisted filing system. The boxes were arranged by city names written in black marker. Portland, Seattle, Phoenix, and 2 other cities I didn't recognize at first. Colin started pulling boxes down, and we saw each one was labeled with initials instead of full names. The Portland boxes had my mom's initials. The Seattle boxes had Colin's mom's initials. The Phoenix boxes had Michelle's mom's initials. But there were boxes labeled with initials that didn't match any of the women we knew about. One set said VNC and another said ST. I looked at Colin and felt my stomach turn as I realized what we were looking at. My dad had organized his entire secret life into boxes, keeping records of every family separated and cataloged like some kind of business operation. Colin opened one of the VNC boxes and pulled out bank statements, lease agreements, and utility bills for an address in Denver. I sat down on the concrete floor because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. There was a 4th family and probably a 5th based on the SDT boxes stacked in the corner. We found travel records in the Denver boxes showing flights and hotel stays going back 15 years. The pattern was different from the 2-week rotations we'd already mapped out for Portland, Seattle, and Phoenix. These trips were shorter, usually long weekends or single weeks scattered throughout the year. Colin and I looked at each other with the same tired horror on our faces. We'd been awake for hours going through evidence, and each new discovery made it worse. I asked how many families one person could have, and Colin just shook his head. He looked exhausted and angry and sad all at the same time. We started photographing everything with our phones because we couldn't carry all the boxes and needed records of what we were finding. The storage unit felt like a tomb full of secrets and lies, each box holding another family's worth of deception. Michelle called around noon and said she was driving up from Phoenix because she couldn't handle sitting alone in her apartment anymore. I told her about the storage unit and the boxes and the evidence of more families. She went quiet for a long time before saying she'd be at my place by late afternoon. Colin and I spent another 2 hours at the storage unit loading the most important boxes into our cars. We took the Denver boxes and the STO boxes along with anything that looked like it might explain how our dad managed all of this. By the time we got back to my apartment, we were both running on coffee and shock. We spread everything out on my living room floor again, adding to the piles we'd already created. Michelle arrived around 4, looking like she hadn't slept either. The 3 of us sat surrounded by evidence of a 4th family and possibly a 5th, not saying much because what was there left to say? My dad had lived 5 separate lives, and we were only starting to understand how deep the deception went. Colin opened the Denver box and pulled out a photo album we'd somehow missed at the storage unit. Inside were pictures of our dad with a woman who looked to be in her 40s and a teenage boy wearing a Broncos jersey. The boy had our dad's smile, the same crooked grin I saw in the mirror every day. I stared at the photo and felt like I was looking at another version of myself, another son who grew up thinking he had a normal family with a dad who traveled for work. Michelle took the album and flipped through more photos showing birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and regular family dinners. There were probably 50 pictures documenting years of this other family's life. Colin found more photos showing the boy at different ages, from maybe 7 or 8 up to what looked like high school graduation. Our dad was in almost every picture, smiling and hugging this other son the same way he'd hugged us. Michelle set down the photo album and said we needed to hire a private investigator because this was beyond what we could handle on our own. She was right, but the idea of paying someone to uncover more pain felt surreal and wrong. Colin agreed, though, saying we needed a professional who could track down these other families and figure out the complete picture. I nodded and pulled out my laptop to start searching for investigators who specialized in family cases. We spent an hour reading reviews and comparing services before I found someone named Alexander Shields who had good ratings and experience with complicated family situations. I sent him an email explaining briefly what we'd discovered and asking if he could help. He responded within 30 minutes saying he could meet us the next day at his office. His quick response and professional tone made me feel slightly less like I was losing my mind. Alexander's office was downtown in a building I'd driven past 100 times. We met him the next afternoon, and he listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. When we finished, he asked to see all the evidence we'd compiled. We spent 2 hours showing him credit card statements, travel records, rental agreements, and photos. Alexander went through everything carefully, organizing documents into piles and asking questions about timelines and dates. His calm way of handling everything made the situation feel more manageable somehow, like this was a problem that could be solved instead of an impossible nightmare. When he finished reviewing the evidence, Alexander said we had strong indicators of at least one more family in Denver, and possibly another one based on the STO boxes. He estimated it would take 6 to 8 weeks to conduct a thorough investigation and track down everyone involved. The timeline felt both too long and too fast at the same time. We discussed Alexander's fees, and I felt my chest tighten when he quoted the retainer amount. It was a lot of money, but we all agreed we needed answers more than we needed savings. The 3 of us split the cost equally, each of us writing checks that would hurt our bank accounts but felt necessary. I was struck by how quickly we'd become a team, 3 strangers united by shared trauma and the need to understand what our father had done. Michelle made a dark joke about at least getting siblings out of this nightmare, and Colin laughed in a way that wasn't really happy. We signed the contract with Alexander and scheduled a follow-up meeting for 2 weeks later. Walking out of his office, I felt different from when we'd walked in, like we'd taken some kind of action instead of just drowning in evidence and shock. The next 2 weeks dragged by in a strange blur where I went through the motions at work while my brain stayed stuck on the investigation. I sat in meetings staring at spreadsheets without seeing the numbers. My coworkers talked about quarterly projections, and I nodded along while calculating how many half-siblings might exist. During a budget review on Tuesday, my boss asked me a direct question about the marketing spend, and I had to ask him to repeat it twice. He gave me a concerned look, but moved on to someone else. Thursday morning, I zoned out so completely during a presentation that I didn't notice everyone staring at me until my boss said my name 3 times. After the meeting ended, he asked me to stay behind. He closed the conference room door and sat down across from me with his arms folded. I told him I was dealing with a complicated family situation and needed some flexibility for the next few weeks. He said he understood and asked if there was anything the company could do to help. I thanked him but said I just needed time to sort things out. He nodded and told me to take whatever time I needed, but I caught the worry in his expression when I left early that afternoon for the third time that week. My phone rang Friday evening while I was microwaving leftovers, and Alexander's name flashed on the screen. I answered immediately and he got straight to business. He confirmed a fourth family in Denver with documentation going back over 2 decades. My legs went weak and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet. Alexander kept talking about rental agreements and school records while the room tilted sideways. Then he said something about indicators of a possible 5th family in another city, and I thought I might throw up. I asked him how confident he was about the 5th one, and he said 60% based on financial patterns that didn't match the other 4 families. I thanked him and hung up, then sat on that kitchen floor for 20 minutes staring at nothing. I texted Colin and Michelle immediately, and we agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my office the next morning. We got there right when they opened at 7 and claimed a corner booth away from other customers. I spread out Alexander's preliminary report on the table between us, and we read through it in silence. Michelle kept shaking her head, and Colin's jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscle jumping. The Denver family consisted of a woman named Veronica Curtis and her son Hudson McFadden, who was 32 years old. Alexander included a link to Hudson's social media profile, and I pulled it up on my phone. The first photo showed a man with dark hair and our father's exact smile standing next to a motorcycle. I turned the screen toward Colin and Michelle and watched their faces go pale. We spent the next hour debating whether we even wanted to know about a potential 5th family. Michelle argued that we'd already opened this door and couldn't close it halfway. Colin said maybe some truths were better left buried. I understood both sides because part of me wanted to stop digging before we found something even worse. But we voted and ultimately agreed we needed the complete picture no matter how painful. The question then became how to contact Hudson without destroying him the way we'd been destroyed. Michelle said she should make first contacts and she'd handled the initial revelation better than Colin or me. We spent another 2 hours crafting a message that explained everything without sounding insane. Michelle sent it from the coffee shop, and we all stared at her phone waiting for a response. Hudson replied within 30 minutes and his message was pure anger. He accused us of running some kind of sick scam and said he'd report us if we contacted him again. Then he blocked Michelle before she could respond. We sat there looking at each other across the table, realizing this wasn't going to be easy. I called Alexander and explained what happened. He suggested sending Hudson a registered letter with copies of all the evidence so he could verify everything independently without feeling ambushed. That made sense, so we agreed, and I volunteered to write the letter since I was the oldest. I spent that entire evening at my dining room table trying to find words that could explain the impossible. I wrote about finding Colin at the gym and discovering Michelle and hiring Alexander. I included copies of credit card statements and rental agreements and travel records spanning 3 decades. I explained that we understood his anger and disbelief because we'd felt the same way. I sealed everything in a large envelope and sent it certified mail the next morning. 2 weeks crawled by with no response from Hudson, and I started wondering if he'd thrown the letter away without reading it. I checked my phone constantly and jumped every time it rang. Alexander called to say some people choose denial over facing painful realities, and we might need to accept that Hudson wasn't ready for the truth. I told Colin and Michelle, and we discussed whether to try again or leave Hudson alone. Michelle said we'd done everything we could, and the rest was up to him. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, Colin texted that Hudson had just called him. I immediately called Colin back and he put me on speaker. Hudson's voice came through shaking with rage. He demanded to know why we were doing this to his family and what we wanted from him. Colin stayed remarkably calm and said we didn't want anything except to share the truth. He offered to meet Hudson in person with all the evidence if that would help. There was a long silence on the other end before Hudson said he'd think about it and hung up. 3 days later, Hudson called back and said he'd fly to Portland the next week to prove we were running some kind of scam. Then he'd never contact us again. His voice shook with anger when he told me not to waste his time and hung up before I could respond. I texted Colin and Michelle immediately, and we agreed to meet at my apartment the day before Hudson arrived so we could prepare everything. The week dragged by and I couldn't focus at work, kept imagining Hudson's face when he saw the 3 of us together. I left the office early on Friday and drove straight to the grocery store to buy drinks and snacks, then went home and started cleaning. I scrubbed the kitchen counters twice and vacuumed the living room 3 times, organizing the stacks of evidence into neat piles on my coffee table. I kept rearranging the documents, trying to figure out the best order to present everything so Hudson would understand immediately. Colin texted around 6 saying he and Michelle were on their way over and asking if I needed anything. I told him to bring more folders because we'd run out of ways to organize 30 years of lies. They showed up an hour later and found me reorganizing the evidence for the 4th time. Michelle took one look at me and said I needed to stop cleaning and sit down before I wore a hole in the carpet. We ordered pizza and went through our plan for the next day, deciding who would explain what and how to handle Hudson's anger. Colin suggested we let Hudson see all 3 of us together first before saying anything, let the physical resemblance speak for itself. Michelle agreed and said the evidence would be more convincing after he saw our faces side by side. I barely slept that night, kept checking my phone to see if Hudson had canceled his flight. He texted at 6 in the morning saying he'd landed and would be at my apartment by 9. I got up and made coffee, then paced around my living room until Colin and Michelle arrived at 8:30. We stood there looking at each other, 3 strangers who shared a father and a terrible secret, waiting to meet a 4th. Hudson knocked on my door at exactly 9, and I opened it to find a tall guy with our dad's jawline and the same way of standing with his weight on his left foot. He looked at me with pure hostility and started to say something, then stopped when he saw Colin and Michelle standing behind me in the living room. His face went pale and he took a step back, staring at the 3 of us lined up with matching eyes and noses and the same slight gap between our front teeth. I watched him process what he was seeing, his anger crumbling into confusion, and then something that looked like fear. He walked inside slowly and sat down hard on my couch without being asked. Michelle handed him a bottle of water, and he took it without looking at her, still staring at our faces like he was trying to find differences that would prove this wasn't real. I sat down across from him and pushed the first folder of evidence toward him. Credit card statements showing charges in Denver, alongside Portland and Seattle and Phoenix. Hudson opened the folder with shaking hands and started reading. We spent the next 6 hours going through everything we'd found, while Hudson moved through denial and anger, and finally into devastated acceptance. He kept saying his mom would have known, his dad wouldn't have done this to them, but then he'd find another piece of evidence that matched his childhood perfectly. Around hour 3, he found a receipt for a Broncos jersey purchased the same week he got one for his birthday, and he put his head in his hands. Colin showed him the apartment rental agreements and plane tickets, the perfect 2-week rotations that lined up with all our childhoods. Michelle pulled up photos of our dad with each of our families, and Hudson stared at them for 20 minutes without speaking. By evening, he was crying and apologizing for not believing us, saying he should have known something was wrong when his dad missed so many important events. I told him we all thought the same thing, that our dad was just busy with work, and Hudson laughed bitterly and said at least we were all equally stupid. Hudson wiped his eyes and told us his mother had been sick recently, some kind of heart condition that was getting worse, and he was terrified this news would kill her. His voice broke when he said she'd loved our dad completely, and finding out the truth might be too much for her to handle. Michelle reached over and squeezed his hand, said we understood, and he could tell his mom whenever he felt she was strong enough to hear it. Colin and I agreed immediately, and Hudson looked at us with something like gratitude mixed with grief. We all sat there in silence for a while, 4 people who should have been strangers but were bound together by our father's choices. I got up and grabbed my phone, pulled up my contacts, and sent my number to Hudson's phone. Colin and Michelle did the same, and suddenly we had a group chat, 4 siblings who never should have existed together. Hudson put his phone away and said something that made Michelle laugh, a harsh sound with no humor in it. He told us he'd always wanted siblings growing up, used to beg his parents for a brother or sister, and now he was getting his wish in the worst possible way imaginable. Michelle stopped laughing and said, at least we were all getting what we wanted, just 30 years too late, and with a side of emotional devastation. Colin suggested we order dinner because none of us had eaten since morning, and we needed to figure out what came next. We were halfway through discussing pizza toppings when my phone rang with Alexander's number. I answered and put him on speaker so everyone could hear. Alexander's voice came through calm and professional, saying he'd found evidence of a potential 5th family and needed to share what he'd discovered. My stomach dropped and I looked at the other 3, saw my own dread reflected in their faces. He told us about a woman named Selena Trevino in Sacramento, with a 12-year-old daughter named Alana, showed evidence of our dad's presence in their lives until his death. I felt sick when he said 12 years old because that meant there was a child involved, someone who still believed her dad was a good person. Hudson asked if Alexander was sure, and he said yes. The evidence was solid, plane tickets and credit card charges and social media photos going back over a decade. We thanked him and hung up, then sat staring at each other across my living room, trying to process that our dad had 5 separate families. Colin grabbed his laptop and said we needed to talk about this right now, figure out how to handle telling a kid that her dad had 4 other families she never knew about. He set up a video call and we spent an hour debating whether we should wait until Alana was older, or tell the truth now. Hudson argued strongly for waiting, said she was too young to handle this kind of betrayal, and we should let her keep her good memories a few more years. Michelle disagreed and said secrets had already caused enough damage, that Alana deserved to know the truth even if it hurt. I pointed out that we couldn't make this decision for Selena, that she was Alana's mother and should decide when and how to tell her daughter. Colin agreed and said we needed to contact Selena first, let her know what we'd discovered and give her time to process before involving Alana. We all agreed that Selena needed to know first and should be the one to decide about telling Alana. I volunteered to make first contact since I was the oldest, and somehow that felt like it made me responsible for delivering this news. Hudson asked if I was sure and I said no, but someone had to do it and it might as well be me. I pulled up Selena's social media profile that Alexander had sent and crafted a careful message explaining I was Noah Hutchinson's son and needed to discuss something important about his estate. I read it out loud to the others, and they suggested a few changes to make it less alarming. Then I hit send before I could change my mind. We ordered Chinese food and tried to talk about anything else while we waited, but the conversation kept circling back to how our dad had managed to keep 5 families separate for so long. My phone buzzed 4 hours later with a response from Selena. Her message was short and confused, saying she didn't understand why I was contacting her because Noah had died over a year ago and there was no estate to discuss. I showed the message to the others and we looked at each other, knowing we were about to destroy another family's peace. Colin said I should ask to talk by phone so I could explain everything properly, and I typed out a response asking if she had time for a call. Selena replied within minutes saying yes, she could talk now, and I stepped out onto my balcony with my phone while the others waited inside. I stood there in the cold evening air trying to figure out how to tell a widow that her husband had 4 other families, that her daughter had 4 half-siblings she'd never met, that everything she thought she knew about her life was built on lies. I pressed the call button and listened to it ring 3 times before Selena answered. Her voice was careful and quiet when she said hello. I introduced myself again and asked if she had a few minutes to talk about something important regarding Noah. She said yes, but I could hear the confusion in her tone. I started by explaining that I'd recently discovered some information about Noah's life that she needed to know. There was silence on the other end. I told her I was Noah's son and that he'd passed away in a car accident in March last year. Selena made a small noise like she'd been hit. She said Noah had died in March too, that she'd been a widow for 14 months. I heard her start to cry. I stood there on my cold balcony feeling like the worst person alive for doing this over the phone. I explained as gently as I could that Noah had multiple families, that I'd found 3 other siblings so far. Selena cried harder and asked how that was even possible. I told her about the 2-week rotation pattern, the separate cities, the decades of deception. She asked if I was sure and I said yes, we had all the evidence. Selena went quiet for a long time and I thought maybe she'd hung up. Then she asked about Alana and whether I knew about her daughter. I said yes, that's why I was calling, because Alana deserved to know the truth eventually. Selena confirmed that Noah was Alana's father. She said they'd been together for 13 years. Noah traveled constantly for his consulting work, and she never questioned it because the money was good, and he always came home. She worked night shifts as a nurse, so their schedules never quite lined up anyway. I asked if she'd ever suspected anything, and Selena laughed, but it sounded painful. She said no, never, not once. I offered to send her all the documentation we'd collected, but Selena said she didn't need to see it. Too many little things were suddenly making sense now. The way he never wanted her to visit his work sites, how he refused to add her to his insurance, the separate bank accounts he insisted on keeping. She asked how many other families there were, and I heard her voice crack when I told her 5 total. Selena started crying again. I waited while she processed, listening to her breathe and cry on the other end of the line. Finally, she asked about the other children, and I told her there were 4 of us who were adults, and then Alana. She asked what we wanted from her. I said we didn't want anything. We just thought she deserved to know the truth. Selena asked if we were planning to contact Alana, and I said no. That decision was completely up to her as Alana's mother. I promised we weren't trying to mess up their lives or take anything away from them. Selena said she needed time to think about how to handle this. I told her to take all the time she needed, and that we'd wait for her to reach out when she was ready. She thanked me for calling instead of just showing up or sending a letter. I gave her my number and email and said she could contact me anytime. After we hung up, I stood on the balcony for another 10 minutes before I could face going back inside. Colin, Michelle, and Hudson were all watching me when I came through the door. I told them Selena knew everything now, and that she was going to decide about telling Alana. Nobody said anything for a while. Over the next 3 weeks, the 4 of us started a group chat where we shared memories of our dad. It felt weird at first, talking about him with people who knew a completely different version of the same man. Michelle sent a photo of Noah teaching her to ride a bike. Colin shared a video of Noah at his high school graduation. Hudson posted a picture of them at a Broncos game wearing matching jerseys. I contributed a photo from a camping trip where Dad was showing me how to start a fire. We started comparing notes on his habits and quirks. He told all of us the same dumb jokes. He had the same morning routine in every house. He watched the same news channel and drank his coffee the same way. It was like he'd created this perfect template of himself and just copied it across 5 different lives. Michelle asked if anyone else remembered him humming while he cooked, and we all said yes. Hudson mentioned that Noah always fell asleep during movies, and we all laughed because that was true for every single one of us. The group chat became a strange kind of therapy, where we could talk about our dad without having to explain the impossible situation to outsiders. We started trying to understand how he'd managed this for so long. Colin pointed out that our dad must have had incredible organizational skills to keep 5 families straight. Michelle said he probably had systems and routines that helped him remember which life he was living. I mentioned finding color-coded folders in his storage unit, and Hudson said that tracked with the kind of planning this would require. We weren't making excuses for him, but we were trying to understand the psychology of someone who could love 5 families while lying to all of them. During this same period, my mom told me she was meeting Colin's mom for coffee. She sounded nervous about it on the phone. I asked if she was sure she wanted to do that, and she said yes, that she needed to talk to someone who truly understood what she was going through. They met at a cafe halfway between Portland and Seattle. My mom called me afterward and said it had been surprisingly helpful. Colin's mom had the same questions, the same anger, the same grief. They'd both loved the same man and been betrayed by him in identical ways. My mom said it was comforting to not have to explain herself or justify her feelings. Colin called me later and said his mom felt the same way. They'd exchanged numbers and planned to meet again. A week after that, Michelle told us her mom wanted to join them. The 3 women started meeting every week at different locations. They called it their support group, and my mom said it was the only place she felt like people really got what she was dealing with. I was amazed by how they'd turned their shared pain into connection instead of competition. They could have hated each other, but instead they were building something that looked like friendship. Alexander called me with his final report around the same time. He'd finished his investigation and confirmed 5 families with no indicators of any others. He'd checked every city Noah had traveled to, every credit card charge, every property record. 5 families was the complete count. I felt this weird sense of relief even though 5 was already an impossible number. At least there was a limit to it. At least we knew the full scope now. I told the others and Hudson said he was glad we finally had a definite answer. Colin said 5 was enough. He couldn't handle finding out about a 6th. Michelle agreed and said she was ready to stop looking and start processing. A few days later, Hudson called me sounding panicked. He'd told his mother Veronica everything. We'd all agreed to let him choose the timing, but he'd decided she needed to know. Veronica hadn't taken it well. She'd had some kind of stress-related episode, and Hudson had to call an ambulance. They'd admitted her to the hospital for observation. Hudson felt terrible. He kept apologizing like it was his fault, even though we all told him he'd done the right thing. Michelle and I offered to fly to Denver, but Hudson said his mom needed quiet and rest. The doctors were monitoring her heart and blood pressure. We all felt guilty for causing more pain to someone who'd already been through enough. Veronica spent 3 days in the hospital before they released her. Hudson called to say she was home and doing better. A week after that, Veronica asked Hudson to set up a video call with all 4 of us siblings. We arranged it for a Saturday afternoon. When the call connected, Veronica looked tired, but her voice was steady. She thanked us for giving Hudson time to tell her properly. Then she said something that made me want to cry. She told us that none of this was our fault, that we were all victims of our father's choices just like the mothers were. She said we didn't choose to be born into this situation, and we shouldn't carry guilt for simply existing. Veronica said she was glad we'd found each other, and that Noah would have wanted us to be family, even if he'd created that family in the worst possible way. Michelle started crying on screen. Colin had to turn his camera off for a minute. Hudson looked at his mom like she'd just saved his life. I managed to thank her and tell her we appreciated her kindness. Veronica smiled and said she meant every word. A few days later, Alexander called to schedule a final meeting at his office downtown. The 4 of us siblings met him there on a Wednesday afternoon, and he had 3 thick folders waiting on his conference table. Alexander opened the first folder and started walking us through bank statements, tax returns, and investment accounts spanning 3 decades. Our father had earned substantial income as a genuine business consultant, not the fake cover story we'd all assumed. He'd maintained completely separate bank accounts for each family, never mixing funds or accidentally paying one family's bills with another family's money. The organization was meticulous and honestly impressive in the worst possible way. Alexander showed us spreadsheets he'd created tracking every deposit and withdrawal. Each family had received roughly equal financial support, adjusted for cost of living in their respective cities. He'd even maintained separate retirement accounts and life insurance policies for each household. Hudson stared at the documents for a long time before speaking. He said at least our dad was a good provider while being a terrible person. The comment landed heavy in the room because Hudson was right. Our father had worked incredibly hard to support 5 families financially, which somehow made the betrayal feel more calculated and deliberate. He hadn't been struggling or desperate. He'd built this complex life on purpose and maintained it with careful planning for 30 years. Michelle asked Alexander if there were any financial red flags or signs of stress. Alexander said no. The accounts showed steady growth and responsible management. Our father had apparently been excellent with money even while being awful with honesty. I felt my stomach turn looking at the neat columns of numbers that represented my entire childhood. Every birthday present, every school supply, every family vacation had been funded by money carefully separated from his other family's funds. The financial revelation made everything feel more real and more painful. After the meeting, we went to a coffee shop because none of us wanted to be alone. Hudson kept saying he didn't know how to feel about discovering his dad was financially responsible. Colin said it was easier when we could just be angry, but now we had to accept that he genuinely provided for us while lying about everything else. Michelle pointed out that being a good provider doesn't excuse betrayal, but it does complicate the grief. We sat there for 2 hours trying to process this new layer of confusion. 3 days later, my phone rang with a California number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard Selena's voice, shaky but determined. She said she was ready to tell Alana the truth and asked if I'd be available by phone for support. I told her yes immediately and asked when she planned to talk with her daughter. Selena said that evening after dinner, and she wanted to know she could call me if Alana had questions or needed to hear from one of her older siblings. I felt honored by her trust despite the circumstances. I gave her my schedule for the evening and promised to keep my phone on. Selena thanked me and said she'd been working with a therapist to figure out how to explain this to a 12-year-old. She hung up, and I spent the rest of the day anxious and distracted. Around 8 that night, Selena called back. Her voice was steadier than I expected. She said Alana had cried at first, but was handling it better than Selena had feared. Alana was confused about how her dad could have other families, but she wasn't angry at us for existing. Selena said her daughter's main question was whether she could meet her older siblings someday. I felt my throat tighten hearing that. I told Selena we'd love to meet Alana whenever she felt ready. Selena asked if we could start with a video call to keep things low pressure. I agreed and said I'd coordinate with Colin, Michelle, and Hudson. We scheduled the call for the following Saturday afternoon. When Saturday came, the four of us logged into the video chat from our separate homes. Selena appeared on screen with Alana sitting next to her. Alana looked nervous but curious, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. We kept the conversation light and let her ask whatever she wanted. She asked basic questions about our ages and where we lived. Then she asked if we all had the same smile like she did. Michelle started crying and said yes, we do. Alana smiled and we could all see it, that same crooked smile our father had. We talked for about 40 minutes before Alana started looking tired. Selena thanked us for being so welcoming to her daughter. After we hung up, our sibling group chat exploded with messages about how sweet Alana seemed and how unfair this whole situation was for her. 2 weeks after that, I got a call from an attorney named Finn, who said he was handling our father's estate. He explained that the will was contested by creditors who discovered additional heirs during their asset search. Finn needed documentation of all 5 families to properly distribute assets according to state law. I told him I'd gather everything and coordinate with my siblings. Finn said he'd need birth certificates, DNA tests if available, and any other proof of paternity. I spent the next few days collecting documents and working with Colin, Michelle, and Hudson to compile everything. We scheduled a meeting at Finn's office for the following week. The 4 adult siblings sat in Finn's conference room while he explained the legal situation. Technically, only children named in the will had direct claims to the estate, but there was enough documentation of our father's relationships with all 5 families that a judge would likely recognize all of us. Finn asked how we wanted to handle the division. We looked at each other and Hudson spoke first. He said we should split everything equally 5 ways, including Alana's share. Colin, Michelle, and I agreed immediately. Finn looked surprised and said most families fight viciously over much smaller estates than this one. Colin said we'd already lost enough without turning on each other over money. Finn nodded and said he'd draw up the paperwork for equal distribution. He warned us the process would take several months to finalize, but our cooperation would make it much faster than contested estates usually took. Around the same time, my mom called to tell me the Mothers Group had expanded their meetings to include a grief counselor who specialized in complicated loss. She said it was helping her separate the good memories from the lies, to hold both truths at once without feeling like she had to choose. I was glad they had professional support, because this situation was beyond what any of us could process alone. A week later, I made my first appointment with a therapist named Kent, who came recommended by Selena's therapist. I sat in Kent's office and tried to explain my identity crisis, how every memory of my father felt tainted, but also still real. Kent listened and then said something that shifted my perspective. He told me my father's deception doesn't negate the real love and experiences we shared. The memories happened, the feelings were genuine, even if they existed within a framework of lies. Kent said I could grieve both the father I lost and the father I never really knew. I could be angry at his choices while still loving the man who raised me. The permission to hold contradictory feelings helped more than I expected. I left that first session feeling like maybe I could eventually make sense of this impossible situation. 2 weeks after my first therapy session, Hudson called to say he'd found something at Veronica's house while helping her sort through storage boxes. He wouldn't tell me what it was over the phone, but said we all needed to see it together. Colin, Michelle, and I met at my apartment that evening, and Hudson walked in carrying a leather journal with our father's initials stamped on the cover. He set it on my coffee table, and we all stared at it like it might explode. Hudson said Veronica had kept it with other personal items and never looked inside because it felt like invading privacy. He'd opened it by accident while looking for old tax documents and realized what it was after reading the first page. We sat on the floor around the coffee table, and Hudson opened to the beginning. The first entry was dated 15 years ago and started with our father writing about how he loved all his families, but couldn't figure out how to keep them all without lying. I felt sick reading his words because he knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Colin turned pages slowly, and we read entry after entry describing the logistics of maintaining 5 separate lives. Our father had written about scheduling conflicts, close calls with overlapping trips, and the constant fear of getting caught. He wrote about loving each of his partners and children genuinely, but feeling trapped by the web of lies he'd created decades earlier. Michelle pointed to an entry where he described watching her high school graduation and feeling proud while also feeling guilty that her half-siblings would never meet her. The journal showed he understood the pain he was causing, but couldn't bring himself to confess because he was too afraid of losing everyone. He wrote about considering telling the truth multiple times but always backing out at the last minute. Reading his justifications made me angry because he had so many chances to fix this and chose his own comfort over honesty every single time. Hudson found an entry from 3 years ago where our father listed all his children's names and wrote about wishing we could all know each other. He'd written that we would probably get along well, and he felt terrible for keeping us apart. The selfishness of wanting credit for that thought without actually doing anything about it made my hands shake. Michelle flipped ahead and stopped at an entry from 2 months before his death. Our father had written about planning to tell everyone the truth before he died because he didn't want us to find out after he was gone. He wrote that he was tired of lying and wanted to face the consequences while he was still alive to explain himself. But then he wrote about being too scared to actually go through with it and deciding to wait a little longer. That entry was dated 6 weeks before the car accident that killed him. We sat in silence after reading the whole journal because there wasn't anything to say that would make sense of what we'd just read. Our father had loved us all genuinely, while simultaneously being too cowardly to choose honesty over his own fear of abandonment. Colin said quietly that at least we knew he'd thought about telling the truth, but Michelle snapped back that thinking about it while doing nothing was almost worse than never considering it at all. I agreed with Michelle because our father had written extensively about his guilt and awareness, while continuing to lie to everyone right up until his death. Hudson closed the journal and asked what we should do with it. We talked for over an hour about whether Alana should ever read these entries. Selena had given us permission to make decisions about what to share with her daughter regarding our father's life. Michelle argued that Alana deserved to know everything eventually, but I said 12 was too young to process this level of calculated deception from a parent she'd loved and trusted. Colin suggested we keep the journal safe and let Selena decide when Alana was old enough to handle it. Hudson agreed and said we should at least wait until she was 18 or older. We called Selena on video and showed her the journal, reading a few entries aloud so she understood what it contained. She cried while listening, and then thanked us for protecting Alana from information that would hurt more than help right now. Selena said she trusted us to make good decisions about what her daughter should know and when. We agreed to keep the journal in a safe deposit box that all 4 adult siblings could access, with the understanding that we'd revisit the decision about sharing it with Alana when she was older. That conversation happened in March, 9 months after I'd first seen Colin's tattoo at the gym. 6 months after that initial discovery, we organized a memorial service for our father that included all 5 families. None of the mothers had wanted to plan it because the grief was too complicated, so the 4 adult siblings took over the arrangements. We rented a community center in Portland since it was central to most of the families, and sent invitations to everyone. The day of the service felt strange because we were gathering to remember a man who'd hurt everyone in that room. My mom and Colin's mom arrived together since they'd become close through their support group. Michelle's mom came with Michelle, and Veronica flew in from Denver with Hudson. Selena drove up from Sacramento with Alana, who seemed nervous about meeting so many new family members at once. We'd set up photos of our father from all 5 families around the room, creating a visual timeline of his entire life that none of us had seen before. Looking at pictures of him with each family at different times made the scope of his deception feel overwhelming. The service started awkwardly because nobody knew quite how to act at a memorial for someone who'd betrayed everyone present. I stood up first and said we were here to acknowledge both the love our father gave us and the pain his choices caused. I talked about how he'd taught me to ride a bike and showed up for my baseball games when he was in town, memories that were real even though they existed alongside lies. Colin spoke next and shared a story about our father taking him camping and teaching him to fish. He said those moments meant something even though we now knew our father had been doing the same things with other families. Michelle got up and talked about how our father had encouraged her art and always told her she could be anything she wanted. Her voice shook when she added that she wished he'd been brave enough to be honest, instead of kind in ways that required deception. Hudson shared a memory of our father helping him with a science project and staying up all night to make sure it was perfect. He said he was learning to separate the good father he'd known from the deeply flawed man who'd made terrible choices. Then Alana stood up and said her dad made the best pancakes and always cut them into funny shapes to make her laugh. She said she missed him and wished he was still here, even though she was mad at him for lying. Everyone in the room smiled through tears because her honesty was exactly what we all felt, but couldn't say as simply. After the service, the 4 adult siblings sat together, and Hudson suggested we meet quarterly to stay connected. He said we didn't ask for this family, but we had it now, and we could choose to make something good from it. Michelle proposed creating a shared photo album online, where we could all upload pictures documenting our father's different lives. She said it would be a way to honor the complicated truth, instead of pretending any version of him was the complete story. Colin and I agreed immediately because it felt right to preserve everything, rather than hiding parts of his life. We exchanged promises to stay in touch and support each other through whatever came next. 9 months after I'd first seen Colin's tattoo at the gym, I sat in my apartment looking at the portrait on my forearm. My father's face looked back at me the same way it always had, but I felt differently about it now. He'd been selfish and cowardly, maintaining 5 families because he couldn't bear to lose any of us, even though his choices hurt everyone. But his love had been real in its own broken way, and I'd gained 4 siblings who understood me in ways nobody else could. I thought about Alana asking if we all had the same smile, and realized we did. We had inherited that from a man who'd given us both genuine love and deep wounds. I was learning to live with the uncertainty of loving someone who'd hurt so many people, holding both truths at once without needing them to make perfect sense. The tattoo would always remind me of my father, but now it also reminded me of Colin and Michelle and Hudson and Alana, the family that came from wreckage and chose to build something better.